Joining me now is John D. Miller, former chief marketer for our sister network, NBC. This week, he wrote in U.S. News and World Report about his regret leading the team that marketed The Apprentice. Also joining me is Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC political analyst and pal of the show. Thank you both for being here. It's great to meet you, Mr. Miller. I want to read you to yourself. I'm going to read you to you. You wrote this. You wrote, "We created a monster. Trump was a TV fantasy invented for The Apprentice. At NBC, we promoted the show relentlessly. Thousands of 30-second promo spots that spread the fantasy of Trump's supposed business acumen were beamed over the airwaves to nearly every household in the country. The image of Trump that we promoted was highly exaggerated. In fact, Trump declared business bankruptcy 4 times before the show went into production, and at least twice more during his 14 seasons hosting. The imposing boardroom where he famously fired contestants was a set because the real boardroom was too old and shabby for TV. I also learned from working with him that he has questionable judgment. At the wrap party for The Apprentice Season 3, he pitched an idea for the upcoming season. This is wild. He told me we should make a team of black players compete against white players. My first thought was, WTF.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the way that that Trump was in reality versus the Trump that people saw on the show.
Well, what you see right now is sort of what he was in reality. He was, to a large degree, someone who was an entertainer. He really was not a good businessman. Our job is, from a marketing perspective, for the conceit of the show, was to make it seem like he was a legitimate businessman, competent, good judgment, compassion when needed. Mm-hmm. None of those things were actually apparent, but that's what we had to do to make the show work. And so we created that narrative, made it seem like it was money, like he was living in royalty, with the cars and the limousines and the helicopter all labeled Trump, in gilded, like the gilded New York age, and then had to position him as a great potential CEO.
Yeah.
And I say potential because he never really was a CEO. Right. He was a lot of little businesses that he had.
Yeah.
But to make the show work, we had to make it seem like that. And unfortunately, that, because we just pummeled American with those messages, that remains there right now. And to many people, even though there is significant things that you can see right now that where that's not true, many people think it is. And right now, with the economy being one of those things that people are looking at, we made him seem to be a very smart businessman. Yeah. And quite honestly, that is not true, because he wouldn't have 4 bankruptcies and then ultimately 6 during the time of Apprentice if he was that good.
Right. And I mean, look, Mark Cuban is on a TV show, but that's because he's judging other businesses, and he's a very successful businessman and really genuinely rich. But Tim, we've talked about this a lot. Donald Trump was not as rich as he said he was. Right. He's definitely not that successful. His company was just a little series of LLCs. He doesn't even own most of the buildings with the word Trump on them. Talk about the real Donald Trump, and what do you think was the damage done by people really genuinely believing that Trump really was successful?
Well, I mean, I think The Apprentice was his ticket into the White House.
Absolutely.
But prior to The Apprentice, he was this punchline of jokes about the excesses of the 1980s. He was out in the tundra. No one did big deals with him. He was an afterthought on comedy shows. He was this sort of subject of ridicule, and New Yorkers knew him as like one of the sort of dirigibles you float above the city as a feature of New York life. But he wasn't a major real estate developer. The real estate community shunned him. And he had this very fortunate intersection with Mark Burnett. Mm-hmm. And Mark Burnett, who was an immigrant, was selling blue jeans in California and read Art of the Deal. And it was like his Bible to the American dream. And he always thought, he told me this, that he would one day do a show that embodied the spirit of The Art of the Deal. But remember, The Art of the Deal itself is a book. It's a nonfiction work of fiction.
That Trump didn't even write.
He didn't even write it, and the whole thing is full of errors and mythologizing and presenting him as a great deal maker when he wasn't a great deal maker. He routinely got taken to the cleaners by other deal makers. He overpaid. He went into debt. Yeah. He went into bankruptcy. And then The Apprentice rolls around via Mark Burnett, and he gets recreated as this entrepreneurial guru to the masses, when in fact he was a serial bankruptcy artist. As you know, as John noted, his real office in Trump Tower was like this relic of the 1980s. Shag carpeting, crummy furniture.
I heard the exact same thing. When I wrote my book, Man Who Sold America, I interviewed somebody who was a contestant on one of the seasons of The Apprentice who said it was kind of shocking to see how shabby the boardroom was in the real Trump Tower.
And he still wears the same suits and ties and shirts that he wore in that
that are down to his knees, like he's a church deacon from the 1980s.
Yeah, like baked in amber of that era. And I think that the myth of him being an unusually gifted businessman is what sold him to voters in 2016.
Yeah, and they still do. You still hear people say, well, I'm going to vote for him because he's a businessman, understands the economy. Let's play a clip from The Apprentice. This is one of the sort of moments when he sort of showed who he really is, the vile person that he is. Here it is.
I, at this point, am the team chooser, not the team leader yet.
Excuse me, you dropped to your knees.
Yes. And begged to do this. And I said, I'm looking around the room, and we had even LaToya, who sitting beside me, thought maybe Brandy was right.
Must be a pretty picture you dropped into
John
your
and
knees.
Dennis.
I mean, that was a glimpse of the real him.
That got into the Celebrity Apprentice at that point, where it sort of got into the later seasons. But he didn't do quite that much to people that he didn't know. Sometimes the celebrities, he could do that a little harder. But going back to the casting, the reason that Donald Trump got cast, because almost no other CEO would do it. They did have a thought of doing some with other CEOs.
Sure. Because they didn't have the time, because they had real jobs and money.
Right.
And dignity.
Yeah, he had, well,
he needed the money, right?
He at that point, because he was bankrupt, yes, and he made most of his money off the integrations of the shows. And the black versus white thing, when he told me about that, I basically had to think about how do I do it, because you don't want to make him mad, but the same token, I had to say, what are you, crazy?
Yeah.
So what I did was I said, I can see why you think that would be a noisy idea, because everybody would be talking about it. Headlines everywhere.
Was the idea that he thought it would prove some sort of racial superiority of white people?
That probably was. And then I said, you're going to lose money because you make most of your money off the integrations, and there's not going to be a company that's going to want to touch that.
And what would he have done if the black team had won? He probably would have had a complete meltdown. The other piece about it is that he benefits from a level of sycophancy that I think most people can't imagine ever having to deal with in their real life. This is Stephen Miller, the architect of his child separation policy, commenting on his performance at the Al Smith dinner. That was the single best comedy performance of any president or candidate for president in history. But what made his comedy set even more extraordinary was that the jokes were politically devastating for Kamala. He absolutely crushed the Democrats tonight. He did the same thing about the Bloomberg interview, the disastrous Bloomberg interview, in which he couldn't even explain tariffs. And he said it was the greatest live interview any political leader or politician has done on the economy of our lifetimes. Period. I mean, he has people doing that for him all the time.
Because to survive in his orbit, you have to kiss the ring.
Yeah.
And he tends to attract C- people.
That guy definitely is that.
Yeah, and I think, in both his business life and political life, he has never had first-rate people who are much sought-after talents. What he has are people who either think they can take advantage of him, they usually are proven wrong, or they're people who are just sub-level and they think that they can get into the spotlight and ride his coattails, and they know to stay there, they've got to bend the knee, kiss the ring.
He is the single most easy person to manipulate that I've ever worked with.
Wow.
And quite honestly, the easiest thing to do, he has an unfillable hole for compliments. People that would make anybody blush and say, oh, no, too much, that never happens to him. So you can do it in grand doses, and when you do that, you're a genius.
Yeah.
And called me many times a genius. I'm a good marketer. I don't know if I'm a genius. But then if you disagree with him, you're an idiot. I don't think I'm an idiot either.
Yeah.
Maybe not, somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But quite honestly, it was black or white with him.
Yeah. And he does it now where he, to try to explain, he tries to say, well, no one wants to work with Kamala Harris and no one wants to work with her. But most of the people who worked with him don't want anything to do with his new campaign. But he says, oh, well, they were terrible people. I fired them because they were awful. Right. Like he can never.
Yes.
And the fact is she's attracted to her campaign some of the best political operatives in the country and Republicans. So
absolutely.
That math doesn't work.
Did it surprise you when the gimmick that made him famous made him president, that he became president?
Yes, well, it was less surprising than disturbing because I knew I was complicit in it.
Yeah.
And that was difficult to do. And the reason that I'm coming forward now, first, I was an executive for a long time, and I really couldn't speak up at that point. I retired a couple of years ago, and I said, well, a few weeks ago, I said, well, what can I do? And I said, I have to tell this story, because I hope it's not too late, but I helped pull the wool over America's eyes towards a guy that should not be president, should never be president, and should be fired from the whole thing.
You know who says the same thing? Tony Schwartz, the guy who really wrote Art of the Deal.
And Tony has a lot of guilt about
it. And he said exactly the same thing, sitting exactly where you're sitting on this set. John D. Miller, thank you so much, and I appreciate you coming forward, truly. Tim O'Brien, my friend, thank you. We appreciate you always.